They laughed when the old sergeant took command, until he saved 400 men in one night. The mortar round hit 30 feet from where Staff Sergeant Emil Kowalski was standing, close enough that the concussion lifted him off his feet and slammed him into the frozen ground like a rag doll. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Through the smoke and snow, he could see the young lieutenant, 23 years old, fresh from officer training, blood running from a gash across his forehead, trying to scream orders that nobody could hear over the artillery barrage hammering their position. The kid was panicking. The entire company was panicking. 400 men, pinned down in a forest clearing in the Ardennes, surrounded by German forces that had punched through the American lines like a fist through wet paper. It was December 17, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was 3 days old. And Emo Kowalski, 52 years old, with a bad knee and reading glasses in his breast pocket, was about to take command whether anyone liked it or not. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. Emo pushed himself to his knees, spat blood, and grabbed the lieutenant by his jacket. The kid's eyes were wide, pupils dilated with shock. He was saying something, maybe orders, maybe prayers, but Emil couldn't hear him. He pulled the lieutenant close and shouted directly into his ear. "Lieutenant, you need to get to the aid station, now!" The lieutenant shook his head, trying to pull away. "I'm fine, I can—" Another mortar round exploded, this one closer. A pine tree 20 yards to their left disintegrated in a shower of splinters and flame. Men were screaming, some were running. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. Emil didn't ask permission. He ripped the map case from the lieutenant's belt, grabbed his radio handset, and shoved him toward 2 medics who were crouched behind an overturned supply truck. Then he stood up, slowly, deliberately, like a man getting out of bed on a Sunday morning, and bellowed in a voice that had been honed across 3 decades of military service. "Third Company! On me! Now!" His voice cut through the chaos like a knife, not because it was loud, though it was, but because it was calm, absolutely, utterly calm. The kind of voice that didn't belong in the middle of an artillery barrage, which meant it was exactly the voice men needed to hear. Soldiers started turning. Some were stumbling through the snow, disoriented. Others were flat on their stomachs, trying to disappear into the frozen earth. But they turned. They looked. And when they saw Emil Kowalski, old, gray-haired, standing upright in the middle of hell, something shifted. He was the oldest man in the company by 15 years. They'd laughed when he'd been assigned to them 2 months ago. Staff Sergeant Grandpa, they'd called him. The relic. He'd been a drill instructor stateside, then a supply sergeant, then a clerk. He wasn't supposed to be here, in the Ardennes, in combat. He was supposed to be filing requisition forms in some rear echelon office. But the army had needed bodies after D-Day. Any bodies. And Emil Kowalski, who'd enlisted in 1915 and somehow never managed to get himself discharged, had found himself on a transport ship to France. Now, he was all they had. He unfolded the map, holding it steady despite the ground shaking beneath his boots. Around him, soldiers were crawling toward his position, using the smoke and snow for cover. A corporal, name tag read Morrison, face smearing with mud and blood, slid into the crater beside him. "Sergeant, the Germans have us boxed in. They're coming from the east and north, and we've got no contact with battalion." Emil glanced at the map, his eyes scanning the terrain with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from reading maps before GPS, before radio triangulation, before any of the technological crutches these young soldiers had learned to depend on. "Where's our armor?" Emil asked. Gone. Pulled back 2 hours ago. We were supposed to follow, but the lieutenant didn't get the order in time. Emil nodded slowly. That explained the panic. The company had been abandoned. 400 men, light infantry, no heavy weapons, no armor support, and now no officers capable of leading. They were a loose collection of frightened boys waiting to die or surrender. Emil looked at Morrison. How many sergeants do we have left? 4, maybe 5. Get them here. 2 minutes. Morrison hesitated. Sergeant, shouldn't we— 2 minutes, Corporal. Move. Morrison moved. Emil stood there in the crater, mortar rounds still falling, snow mixing with ash and smoke, and did something that would have gotten him laughed at in any military academy. He took off his helmet, pulled out his reading glasses, and studied the map like he was planning a Sunday drive. Because that's what leadership was. Not heroics, not speeches, just calm, methodical problem-solving while everything around you burned. By the time Morrison returned with 3 other sergeants, a machine gunner named Chen, a demolitions expert named Dubois, and a signals sergeant named Kowalski, no relation, though they joked about it, Emil had already formulated a plan. He pointed at the map. We're here. Germans are here, here, and probably here. They think we're pinned. They think we're going to sit here until they finish us off or we surrender. Chen, the machine gunner, nodded. That's exactly what's going to happen if we don't move. Then we move. Emil traced a line on the map with his finger. There's a logging road 2 kilometers west, runs through a gorge. Too narrow for armor, but we can move infantry through it. If we can reach that road before the Germans realize we've gone, we've got a chance. Dubois, the demolitions expert, frowned. Sergeant, that road's going to be crawling with Germans. They'll have patrols, maybe roadblocks. Probably, Emil agreed. Which is why we're not taking the road. We're using it as a landmark. We parallel it, stay in the trees, move at night. Slow and quiet. 400 men? Sergeant Kowalski, signals, shook his head. That's not slow and quiet, that's a parade. Then we make it a quiet parade. Emil looked at each of them in turn. You've all got squads. You know who can move silently and who can't. We leave the noisy ones in groups of 20, spaced out every 100 yards. The quiet ones form the vanguard. We leapfrog through the forest until we hit friendly lines. Morrison stared at him. That's not in the field manual. The field manual doesn't cover this situation. Emil folded the map and handed it to Morrison. You're in charge of navigation. Chen, you take the rear guard. Dubois, I need you to rig something that'll make the Germans think we're still here for at least 2 hours after we leave. Kowalski, get on the radio and try to raise anyone. Battalion, division, I don't care if it's a French farmer with a ham radio. We need to know where the front lines are. And you, Sergeant? Morrison asked. Emil picked up his rifle. An M1 Garand was older than half the men in the company. I'm going to walk 400 men through German-occupied forest in the middle of winter and get them home. He said it like he was describing a grocery run. Behind them, another mortar round exploded, closer this time. The Germans were ranging in. We've got 30 minutes before they overrun this position, Emil said calmly. I suggest we use them. The evacuation began in chaos and ended in something resembling order, though it took Emil shouting himself hoarse to get there. 400 men don't disappear from a forest clearing without noise, without confusion, without someone doing something catastrophically stupid. 3 soldiers tried to carry a heavy machine gun that they should have spiked and left behind. A supply sergeant insisted on loading a truck with rations until Emil physically pulled him away and told him to carry what he could and leave the rest. 2 medics refused to leave the wounded until Emil lied that an ambulance convoy was coming. But slowly, incrementally, the company began to move. Emil organized them into 20-man groups, each led by a sergeant or senior corporal. The groups spaced themselves 100 yards apart, moving through the forest in a loose column that stretched nearly a mile. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't textbook, but it was movement, and movement was survival. Dubois, the demolitions expert, stayed behind with a handful of volunteers. His job was to create the illusion of an active defensive position. Trip flares rigged to go off at intervals, a few rifles tied to trees with strings that would pull the triggers when the wind gusted, and a half-dozen smoke grenades on timers. It wouldn't fool the Germans for long, but it didn't have to. Just 2 hours, long enough for the company to disappear into the forest. Emile took point with the first group. Morrison was beside him, compass in hand, map spread across his knees as he crouched behind a fallen log. The forest was dense here, old-growth pine and oak, their branches heavy with snow. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks hidden beneath a white blanket. Every step was treacherous. Behind Emile, a young private, couldn't have been more than 18, whispered nervously, "Sergeant, what if the Germans have patrols in the forest?" Emile didn't turn around. "Then we kill them quietly." "How?" "With a knife, a rock, or your bare hands, whichever's closer." The private fell silent. They moved for an hour, covering maybe a kilometer. It was painfully slow. Every 100 yards, Emile would stop, listen, wait. The forest was full of sounds. Wind through branches, snow sliding off boughs, the distant rumble of artillery. But underneath those sounds, Emile was listening for something else. The crunch of boots, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the low murmur of German voices. Nothing. Not yet. Behind them, back at the clearing, the first of Dubois' timers went off. A trip flare shot into the sky, bathing the trees in harsh white light. Then another. Then the rattle of automatic fire as the rigged rifles discharged. Emile smiled grimly. Dubois had done his job. From a distance, it would sound like a company making a desperate stand. Morrison leaned close. "How long do you think they'll buy it?" "Maybe an hour, maybe less. Depends on whether the Germans are smart or eager. And if they're both, then we move faster." But faster wasn't an option. Not with 400 men, half of them exhausted, some wounded, all of them terrified. They were moving through enemy territory, with no air support, no artillery, no reinforcements. If the Germans discovered them, it would be a massacre. Emile knew this. Every man in the column knew this, but nobody said it out loud. They reached the logging road at 0300 hours. It was exactly where the map said it would be. A narrow dirt track carved through the forest, wide enough for a single truck, bordered by steep embankments on both sides. Snow had drifted across it in uneven dunes, but the tracks were still visible. Tire marks from German vehicles, maybe a day old, maybe less. Emile crouched at the edge of the road, studying the terrain. To the north, the road disappeared into darkness. To the south, it curved around a hill before vanishing into the trees. No lights, no movement, but that didn't mean anything. He gestured for Morrison. "We cross here, one group at a time. Fast and quiet. No talking, no lights, no stopping. Once you're across, head into the trees and keep moving west." Morrison nodded. "How far west?" "Until I tell you to stop." "And if we run into Germans?" "You don't. You avoid them. If you can't avoid them, you kill them. If you can't kill them, you die quietly so you don't give away the rest of the column." Morrison swallowed hard. "Yes, Sergeant." Emile watched the first group cross. They moved like ghosts, 20 men sliding across the road in less than 30 seconds, disappearing into the trees on the far side. Then the second group, then the third. It was working. And then it wasn't. Halfway through the evacuation, with maybe 200 men still waiting to cross, Emile heard it, the low growl of engines, coming from the south, getting closer. He held up a fist, the universal signal for freeze. Every man in the column went still. The sound grew louder. Definitely vehicles, probably trucks, maybe half-tracks. German convoy, moving supplies or reinforcements. Emil made a quick calculation. If the convoy passed without stopping, they'd be fine. If it stopped, if the Germans decided to bivouac here or rest, or worse, set up a checkpoint, the entire evacuation was over. He turned to Sergeant Chen, the machine gunner, who was crouched beside him. "How many rounds do you have?" "Maybe 300? If that convoy stops, we hit them hard and fast. Kill the lead vehicle, kill the rear vehicle, trap the middle. Then we disappear before they can react." Chen stared at him. "Sergeant, that's suicide." "No," Emil said calmly. "Suicide is sitting here and letting them find us." The convoy appeared around the bend. 3 trucks, canvas-covered, moving slowly through the snow. No half-tracks, no armor, just infantry, probably a supply detail heading back to German lines. Emil watched them approach, his hand resting on his rifle. His heart rate was steady. His breathing was controlled. He'd been in situations like this before, not in this war, but in the last one, when he'd been a young private in the trenches of France, watching German patrols move through no man's land. The convoy rolled past. It didn't stop. Emil waited until the sound of the engines faded completely before he allowed himself to exhale. Then he turned to Morrison. "Keep moving. We've got maybe an hour before someone notices we're gone." They crossed the road in groups, 200 men slipping through the night like smoke. By 400 hours, the entire company was on the west side of the logging road, moving deeper into German-held territory. Emil stayed at the rear of the column, making sure every man made it across. When the last group disappeared into the trees, he took one final look back at the road, at the tracks in the snow, at the forest they were leaving behind. Then he followed his men into the darkness. Then, Part 2. The Labyrinth of Tactics. They moved through the forest like a living thing, a column of 400 men stretched across 2 kilometers of frozen wilderness, each group navigating by compass and instinct. Emil rotated between the front and rear of the formation, checking on each group, correcting course, offering quiet words of encouragement or sharp commands depending on what he saw. Most of the men were holding up better than he'd expected. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the fear of being captured by the Germans in winter was about as powerful as motivators got. But exhaustion was setting in. Feet were dragging, shoulders were slumping, some of the men were starting to stumble. Around 600 hours, just as the sky was beginning to lighten, Emil called for a halt. The column stopped in a small depression surrounded by dense undergrowth, good concealment, good cover, defensible if it came to that. He moved through the groups, assessing the damage. 3 men had frostbite on their hands. 5 had blisters that had torn open and were bleeding into their boots. 1 had twisted his ankle, stepping into a hidden root, and was being half-carried by 2 of his squad mates. The medics were doing what they could with dwindling supplies. Emil stopped beside a young soldier who was sitting with his back against a tree, his face pale, his hands shaking. The kid's canteen was empty. His rifle was slung across his lap like he'd forgotten it was there. "What's your name, soldier?" Emil asked. The kid looked up. "Private Jensen, Sergeant." "Where you from, Jensen?" "Iowa, small town outside Des Moines." Emil nodded. "Farm kid?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Then you know about cold. You know how to work through it." Jensen shook his head. "This is different. I can't feel my feet. I can't—" "You can," Emil interrupted. "You just don't want to. But here's the thing, Jensen, wanting doesn't matter. You're going to stand up, you're going to keep walking, and you're going to do it because the alternative is freezing to death in a forest in Belgium while your family back in Iowa wonders what happened to you." Jensen stared at him. "I don't know if I can." Emil leaned closer, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "You don't have to know. You just have to do it. One step, then another. That's all this is. Just steps." Jensen didn't answer, but after a moment, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs shook, but he stayed upright. Emil clapped him on the shoulder. "Good man." He continued through the column, repeating variations of the same speech to different soldiers. Some responded, some didn't. But by the time the sun was fully up, most of the men were back on their feet. Morrison found Emil near the front of the column, studying the map again. "Sergeant, we've got a problem." Emil didn't look up. "Just one?" The signals sergeant tried to raise battalion, no response. He tried division, no response. Either our radio's dead or... "Everyone's dead," Emil finished. "Which do you think it is?" Morrison hesitated. "I think the Germans cut through our lines harder than we thought. I think we're behind enemy lines, deep behind." Emil folded the map. "Then we keep moving west until we're not." "Sergeant, that could be 50 kilometers, maybe more. These men are exhausted. Half of them are injured. We're out of food, low on ammunition, and we've got German patrols everywhere." Emil looked at him. "What's your point, Corporal?" "My point is, maybe we should consider surrender. If we—" "No." "Sergeant!" "No," Emil repeated, his voice flat and hard. "We don't surrender. Not today, not ever. You know what happens to 400 American soldiers who surrender in the Ardennes in December? The Germans march us to a POW camp. Half of us die on the way. The other half freeze or starve before spring. That's if the Germans are feeling merciful. If they're not, they line us up and shoot us. You want to take that chance?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "No, Sergeant." "Then we keep moving." At 800 hours, they encountered their first German patrol. It was a small group, maybe 8 soldiers, moving through the forest on foot, spread out in a loose skirmish line. They were maybe 200 yards north of the column, close enough to hear if anyone made a sound. Emil signaled for the column to freeze. 400 men stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing. They became part of the forest, invisible and silent. The German patrol moved slowly, their rifles at the ready, their eyes scanning the trees. They were looking for something, probably the missing American company, but they weren't looking carefully enough. One of the Germans stopped maybe 50 yards from where Emil was crouched. He lit a cigarette, cupping his hands around the match. The glow was faint but visible. Emil could see the man's face. Young, maybe 20, with a thin mustache and tired eyes. The German took a long drag, exhaled smoke into the cold air, then continued walking. The patrol passed without incident. Emil waited 5 full minutes after the last German disappeared before he signaled the column to continue. They moved through the rest of the morning without contact, though they could hear the war all around them. Distant artillery, the rumble of tanks, the occasional crackle of small arms fire. The front lines were close. How close, Emil couldn't say, but close enough to smell the smoke. Around noon, they reached a small stream, partially frozen. Emil called another halt, let the men refill their canteens. The water was icy, painful to drink, but it was water. Some of the men ate snow instead, which was a mistake. It lowered their core temperature. But Emil didn't have the energy to stop them all. Dubois found him sitting on a fallen log, rubbing his bad knee. The demolitions expert looked worse than he had that morning. Face gaunt, eyes sunken, a bloody bandage wrapped around his left hand. "You're hurt," Emil said. Dubois shrugged. "Cut it on some wire. I'll live." "Good. I need you alive." Dubois sat down beside him. "Sergeant, I've been thinking. We've been lucky so far. No contact, no casualties. But luck doesn't last." "No," Emil agreed. "It doesn't." "So what's the plan when it runs out?" Emil looked at him. "We make new luck." "That's not a plan." "It's the only one we've got." Dubois smiled, a thin, bitter expression. "You know, when they assigned you to us, I thought you were going to get us all killed. Old man, out of shape, no combat experience." "I have combat experience," Emil said quietly. Just not in this war. Dubois blinked. You were in the last one? 1918. Belleau Wood. I was a private. Spent 3 days in a trench watching German machine gunners tear apart my unit. When it was over, there were 12 of us left out of 200. What did you do? I survived. And then I spent the next 26 years making sure I never had to do it again. Emile stood up, testing his knee. Didn't work out. He walked away, leaving Dubois sitting on the log. The column moved through the afternoon, covering another 5 kilometers. The terrain was getting rougher, more hills, steeper slopes, denser forest. The men were slowing down. Some were falling behind. Emile rotated sergeants to the rear, made sure nobody got left. At 1600 hours, just as the light was starting to fade, they heard it. The sound of engines. Not trucks this time, tanks. Emile raised his fist. The column froze. He moved forward carefully, staying low, until he could see through the trees. There, maybe 300 yards ahead, was a road, paved this time, wide enough for armor. And on that road was a German tank column. 4 Panzer IVs moving east, their turrets swiveling slowly as they scanned the forest. Behind the tanks were half-tracks. Behind the half-tracks were more trucks. It was a full battalion, maybe more. Emile crawled back to where Morrison was waiting. We can't cross here, too exposed. We'll have to parallel the road until we find a gap. Morrison looked at the map. Sergeant, if we parallel the road, we're going to run out of forest. There's open farmland 2 kilometers west. Then we cross the farmland at night. Open ground? In winter? The Germans will see us. Not if we're smart about it. Morrison stared at him. You're insane. Probably, Emile agreed, but I'm also in command. So get the men ready to move. We're crossing that farmland tonight, and we're doing it without getting killed. Morrison opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He nodded. Yes, Sergeant. Emile watched the tank column roll past, counting vehicles, memorizing patterns. Then he turned back to his men. 400 faces, all looking at him, all waiting for him to pull off another miracle. Emile didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in stubbornness, and right now, stubbornness was all they had. Part 3. Revelation and Collapse. They waited until full dark before attempting the crossing. The farmland stretched out before them like a frozen ocean, flat, white, featureless. No trees, no cover, just open ground under a clear sky with a moon bright enough to read by. Emile studied the terrain with the cold calculation of someone who'd spent 30 years learning how to stay alive. The farmland was maybe 2 kilometers across. On the far side, he could see the dark line of another forest. Between here and there, nothing. Any German observer with binoculars could spot them. Any patrol with flares could light them up. Any machine gun nest could cut them down. We're going to die out there, Morrison said quietly. Emile glanced at him. Maybe, but we'll die trying to live, which is better than dying because we gave up. He organized the men into the smallest groups possible, 5 soldiers each, spaced 50 yards apart. The idea was to minimize the visual signature. If the Germans spotted one group, maybe the others would make it through. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan. Emile took the first group himself. 5 men, Morrison, Chen, a medic named Patterson, and 2 privates whose names he'd forgotten. He gave them simple instructions. Stay low, move fast, don't stop for anything. They started across the open ground at 2200 hours. The snow was deeper here, untouched by vehicles or foot traffic. Each step sank 6 inches, sometimes more. It was like walking through sand. Emile's bad knee was screaming. But he ignored it. Pain was just information, and right now, the information was irrelevant. They were halfway across when the flare went up. It burst above them with a soft pop, flooding the farmland with harsh white light. Emil dropped flat, and the others followed. They pressed themselves into the snow, trying to disappear, trying to become part of the landscape. The flare drifted lazily on its parachute, burning bright for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it guttered and died, plunging the farmland back into darkness. Emil didn't move. He counted to 60, listening. No shouts, no gunfire. Maybe the flare had been random. Maybe they hadn't been spotted. Or maybe the Germans were just waiting. He raised his head slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. He gestured to the others, and they started moving again, faster now, abandoning stealth for speed. They reached the far side of the farmland at 22:30 hours. Emil collapsed behind a tree, his lungs burning, his knee a ball of white-hot agony. The others dropped beside him, gasping. Morrison looked back across the farmland. How many groups are still out there? Emil forced himself to sit up. 79, maybe 80. That's 400 men. I can do math, Corporal. They waited. One by one, the group staggered into the tree line. Some were running, some were walking, a few were crawling, but they were coming. By midnight, 60 groups had made it across. 15 more were still out there, visible as dark shapes against the snow. Then the machine guns opened up. The sound was unmistakable. The rapid hammering of MG-42s, German machine guns that fired so fast they sounded like ripping canvas. Tracers arced across the farmland, red streaks cutting through the darkness. Men screamed, some dropped, others ran. Emil grabbed Morrison's radio. All groups, scatter and run. Don't stop, don't look back, get to the trees. But it was too late for some of them. Emil watched as one group, 5 men, maybe 100 yards from safety, was cut down in seconds. They didn't even have time to scream. Another group made it to the tree line, but one of the soldiers had been hit. He was clutching his stomach, blood pouring between his fingers. Patterson, the medic, ran to him, but Emil could see from the amount of blood that there was nothing to be done. The machine guns kept firing, sweeping the farmland methodically. More flares went up, turning night into day. The Germans knew exactly where they were now. Emil made a decision. Chen, set up your gun. We need suppressing fire. Chen stared at him. Sergeant, if I open up, they'll know exactly where we are. They already know. Now give those men a chance to get across. Chen hesitated for only a second, then moved. He set up his M1919 machine gun on a fallen log, feeding the belt, chambering the first round. Then he opened fire. The sound was deafening. Tracers streaked across the farmland, aimed at the muzzle flashes from the German guns. It wasn't accurate fire. Chen couldn't see his targets clearly, but it was enough to make the Germans duck, to disrupt their rhythm. The last group sprinted for the trees. Most of them made it. When the firing finally stopped, Emil did a head count. 372 men. They'd lost 28 in the crossing. 28 soldiers who would never see home, never write another letter, never wake up in their own beds. Emil felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. Command wasn't about making the right decisions. It was about living with the wrong ones. Morrison found him sitting alone, staring at nothing. Sergeant, we need to move. The Germans will be sending patrols. Emil nodded, but didn't stand up. I got 28 men killed tonight. You saved 372. That's not how the families will see it. Morrison crouched beside him. Sergeant, with all due respect, the families aren't here. We are, and we're alive because of you. Emil looked at him. You think that makes it easier? No, Morrison said quietly. I think it makes it worth it. Emil stood up slowly, his knee protesting every movement. He looked at the men gathered in the trees, exhausted, frightened, but alive. They were watching him, waiting for orders. He cleared his throat. We've lost men tonight, good men. We'll remember them when this is over. But right now, we need to keep moving. The Germans know we're here, and they're going to come looking. So we march. We march until we hit friendly lines, or until we can't march anymore. Those are the options. Nobody argued. They started moving again at 0100 hours, heading west through the forest. The temperature had dropped below zero. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy. Men were collapsing from exhaustion, hypothermia, despair. Emil moved through the column, pulling them to their feet, pushing them forward. At 0300 hours, Sergeant Kowalski, signals, found Emil at the front of the column. His face was grim. Sergeant, I've been listening to German radio traffic. They're organizing a sweep of this area, battalion strength. They'll be here by dawn. Emil stopped walking. How long do we have? 3 hours, maybe 4. Emil looked at Morrison. How far to friendly lines? Morrison checked the map. Best guess? 10 kilometers, maybe more. We can't cover 10 kilometers in 4 hours, not with these men. Then what do we do? Emil was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we stop running. We start fighting. Morrison's eyes widened. Sergeant, we can't fight a battalion. We barely have ammunition. We don't have to fight them. We just have to slow them down. Emil turned to Dubois. You still have demolitions? Some, not much. Enough to blow a bridge? Dubois frowned. What bridge? Emil pointed at the map. According to this, there's a river 2 kilometers west. Only one bridge across it for 20 kilometers in either direction. If we blow that bridge, the Germans will have to detour. That buys us time. And if there's no bridge, Morrison asked, then we find another way. Emil looked at his men. We've come this far. We're not stopping now. They reached the river at 0400 hours. The bridge was there, a narrow stone structure, old but solid, spanning a river that was mostly ice. And on the far side of the bridge, visible in the pre-dawn light, were American positions. Friendly lines. They'd made it. But between them and safety was one last obstacle. A German checkpoint. 3 guards, a machine gun nest, and a half-track parked across the bridge. Emil studied the checkpoint through a pair of liberated German binoculars. Then he turned to his men. We're going through that checkpoint, fast and hard. Chen, you take the machine gun nest. Dubois, you take the half-track. Everyone else, suppressing fire. We hit them before they know what's happening, and we don't stop until we're across that bridge. Morrison looked at him. And if it doesn't work? Emil checked his rifle. Then we tried. They attacked at 0415 hours, just as the sky was beginning to lighten. Part 4. The Alliance and the Turning Point. The attack was chaos. Controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Chen's machine gun opened up first, a long, rattling burst that tore through the German machine gun nest before the sentries even knew they were under fire. Dubois followed half a second later, lobbing a grenade at the half-track. The explosion was deafening, flipping the vehicle onto its side and sending shrapnel in every direction. The Germans reacted fast. They were professionals, trained and disciplined, but they were also outnumbered and caught completely off guard. By the time they started returning fire, Emil's men were already moving, using the smoke and confusion for cover. Emil led from the front, his M1 Garand barking in short, controlled bursts. He wasn't a young man anymore, wasn't fast, wasn't particularly accurate, but he was steady. And in combat, steady was worth more than speed. A German soldier appeared from behind the overturned half-track, bringing his rifle to bear. Emil shot him twice, Center mass, the way they taught in basic training 30 years ago. The man dropped. Morrison was beside Email, firing as he moved, shouting orders that nobody could hear over the gunfire. Chen's machine gun was still hammering away, pinning down what was left of the checkpoint. Dubois was on the bridge itself, planting charges at the base of the stone supports. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 4 Germans were dead, 2 were wounded, and the rest had retreated into the forest. Email didn't pursue them. He was too busy getting his men across the bridge. They ran, or stumbled, or crawled across the river in a disorganized flood. Some were carrying wounded. Some were carrying equipment. Most were just trying to stay upright. Email stood at the near end of the bridge, counting them as they passed. 372, 371, 370. He waited until the last man was across before he joined them. Dubois was still on the bridge, crouched beside the detonator. "Ready, Sergeant!" he shouted. Email looked back at the forest, where the German battalion would be arriving in less than an hour. Then he looked at the bridge, the last obstacle between his men and safety. "Blow it," he said. Dubois pressed the detonator. The charges went off in sequence, a rippling series of explosions that shook the ground and sent chunks of stone flying into the air. The bridge groaned, swayed, and then collapsed into the river with a sound like thunder. When the dust settled, there was no bridge, just a pile of rubble and a river too wide to ford. Email turned toward the American positions on the far side of the river. Soldiers were emerging from foxholes and bunkers, staring at the bedraggled column of men who just appeared out of nowhere. An officer, a captain by the insignia on his helmet, approached Email, his expression somewhere between disbelief and anger. "Who the hell are you?" the captain demanded. Email saluted wearily. "Staff Sergeant Email Kowalski, 3rd Company, 106th Infantry Division." "The 106th was overrun 3 days ago. We thought—" "We weren't overrun," Email interrupted. "We were surrounded. There's a difference." The captain stared at him. "How many men do you have?" 370, give or take." "You brought 370 men through German lines?" "Yes, sir." The captain opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. That's impossible." Email allowed himself a thin smile. "I don't know about impossible, sir, but it sure as hell wasn't easy." The captain looked past Email at the column of exhausted soldiers, mud-covered, frostbitten, half-starved, but alive. "Get your men to the aid station. I'll radio division, let them know you're here." "Thank you, sir." Email turned to his men and raised his voice one last time. "3rd Company, we're home. Get to the aid station, get warm, get fed. You've earned it." A cheer went up, weak, ragged, but genuine. Men were crying. Some were laughing. A few were just standing there, too exhausted to react. Email watched them file past, each one a miracle. 370. Morrison stopped beside him. "What do we do now, Sergeant?" Email thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "We rest, and then we do it all over again." "You think they'll send us back out?" "Count on it." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad you're still with us." Email didn't answer. He was too busy thinking about the 28 men who weren't. Part 5. Resolution and Legacy. The interrogation, because that's what it was, though they called it a debriefing, lasted 3 days. Officers from Division, from Corps, even from SHAEF wanted to know how Staff Sergeant Email Kowalski had led 400 men through 40 kilometers of German-occupied territory in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. They wanted maps, timelines, tactical breakdowns. They wanted to know every decision, every route, every engagement. Email gave them what they wanted, though he kept it simple. He didn't talk about the fear, or the cold, or the 28 men who didn't make it. He just talked about the terrain, the timing, the tactics. The officers nodded, took notes, and asked more questions. On the 3rd day, a general arrived. Email didn't catch his name, but the stars on his collar made it clear he was someone important. The general sat across from Email in a tent that smelled of cigarette smoke and canvas and asked a single question. "Sergeant, why didn't you surrender?" Email looked at him. "Because surrender's just another word for giving up, sir, and I don't know how to do that." The general studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, a genuine smile, not the thin, professional expression most officers wore. "The Army needs more men like you, Sergeant." "Respectfully, sir, the Army has men like me. They just don't know it yet." The general stood up, offered his hand. Email shook it. "You're being put in for a Silver Star," the general said, "and your men are being reassigned to a reconstituted unit. You'll have command." Email nodded. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, Sergeant. Just keep doing what you're doing." The general left, and Email was alone again. He walked to the aid station afterward, checking on his men. Most were recovering. Some were being evacuated to field hospitals. A few, the ones with frostbite too severe to treat, the ones with infections that had turned septic, would lose fingers, toes, maybe limbs. Email visited them all. He didn't have much to say, didn't try to offer hollow comfort. He just sat with them, let them know they weren't alone. Private Jensen, the farm kid from Iowa, was in one of the beds, his feet wrapped in bandages. He looked up when Email approached. "Sergeant," Jensen said, "they're saying I'm going home, medical discharge." Email nodded. "That's good, Jensen. You did your part." "But I didn't finish. I didn't." "You survived," Email interrupted. "That's finishing. Don't let anyone tell you different." Jensen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell people about this, about what you did." "Don't," Email said. "Tell them about what we all did. That's more important." He left before Jensen could argue. The Silver Star arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a courier along with orders to report to a new unit. Email pinned the medal to his uniform, looked at it for a moment, then took it off and put it in his footlocker. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate it. It was just that medals were for other people, people who needed the recognition, who needed the validation. Email didn't need either. He knew what he'd done. That was enough. 20 years later, in 1964, Email Kowalski retired from the Army at the rank of Command Sergeant Major. He'd served in Korea, trained soldiers for Vietnam, and spent the last 5 years of his career teaching tactics at Fort Benning. He was 72 years old when he finally left the service. Older than any regulation allowed, but the Army had stopped trying to force him out after the 3rd waiver request. At his retirement ceremony, a young lieutenant asked him what it was like to save 400 men in one night. Email thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't save anyone. They saved themselves." "I just pointed them in the right direction." "But you led them. "I made decisions," Email interrupted. "Some were right, some were wrong. The men lived with the consequences either way. That's not saving, that's just command." The lieutenant didn't understand, but that was okay. Email didn't expect him to. He died in 1987, at the age of 95, in a VA hospital in Pennsylvania. No family, no ceremony. Just a quiet passing in the middle of the night. But at his funeral, a small affair, attended mostly by VA staff, something unexpected happened. Over 200 people showed up. Old men mostly, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, all of them wearing pieces of their old uniforms. They were the men from 3rd Company, the ones who'd followed Email Kowalski through 40 kilometers of hell in December 1944. They didn't give speeches. They didn't lay wreaths. They just stood there in silence, a formation of old soldiers paying respect to an older one. And when the bugler played taps, every one of them saluted. In 2003, a historian researching the Battle of the Bulge found a reference in a German after-action report. A company of American soldiers that had appeared and disappeared like ghosts during the fighting in the Ardennes. The report noted that a full battalion had been deployed to intercept them, But the Americans had evaded contact, destroyed a bridge, and escaped to Allied lines with minimal casualties. The German officer who wrote the report had added a single line at the end, almost as an afterthought. "Whoever commanded that unit understood the forest better than we did. He fought like a soldier from the last war, patient, methodical, and utterly without fear. We would do well to learn from his example." The historian tracked down the American unit, 3rd Company, 106th Infantry Division, and he tracked down the commander, Staff Sergeant Emil Kowalski. He tried to contact surviving members of the company, but most were gone. The few who remained all said the same thing. Sergeant Kowalski had saved their lives. Not through heroics, not through brilliance, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. One of them, Private Jensen, now in his 80s, summed it up best. "He didn't look like a hero. He looked like someone's grandfather. But when everything went to hell, he was the only one who didn't panic. He just stood there, calm as could be, and told us what to do. And we listened, because we all knew, that if anyone could get us out alive, it was him." The historian published his findings in a book about forgotten heroes of World War II. It sold moderately well, was reviewed positively, and then disappeared into the vast archive of military history. But for the men who'd been there, who'd walked through that frozen forest in December 1944, the story needed no book. They already know. "Don't," Emil said. "Tell them about what we all did. That's more important." He left before Jensen could argue. The Silver Star arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a courier, along with orders to report to a new unit. Emil pinned the medal to his uniform, looked at it for a moment, then took it off and put it in his footlocker. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate it. It was just that medals were for other people, people who needed the recognition, who needed the validation. Emil didn't need either. He knew what he'd done. That was enough. 20 years later, in 1964, Emil Kowalski retired from the Army at the rank of Command Sergeant Major. He'd served in Korea, trained soldiers for Vietnam, and spent the last 5 years of his career teaching tactics at Fort Benning. He was 72 years old when he finally left the service, older than any regulation allowed, but the Army had stopped trying to force him out after the 3rd waiver request. At his retirement ceremony, a young lieutenant asked him what it was like to save 400 men in one night. Emil thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't save anyone. They saved themselves. I just pointed them in the right direction." "But you led them, you—" "I made decisions," Emil interrupted. "Some were right, some were wrong. The men lived with the consequences either way. That's not saving, that's just command." The lieutenant didn't understand, but that was okay. Emil didn't expect him to. He died in 1987, at the age of 95, in a VA hospital in Pennsylvania. No family, no ceremony, just a quiet passing in the middle of the night. But at his funeral, a small affair, attended mostly by VA staff, something unexpected happened. Over 200 people showed up. Old men, mostly, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, all of them wearing pieces of their old uniforms. They were the men from 3rd Company, the ones who'd followed Emil Kowalski through 40 kilometers of hell in December 1944. They didn't give speeches. They didn't lay wreaths. They just stood there in silence, a formation of old soldiers paying respect to an older one. And when the bugler played taps, every one of them saluted. In 2003, a historian researching the Battle of the Bulge found a reference in a German after-action report. A company of American soldiers that had appeared and disappeared like ghosts during the fighting in the Ardennes. The report noted that a full battalion had been deployed to intercept them, but the Americans had evaded contact, destroyed a bridge, and escaped to Allied lines with minimal casualties. The German officer who wrote the report had added a single line at the end, almost as an afterthought. Whoever commanded that unit understood the forest better than we did. He fought like a soldier from the last war, patient, methodical, and utterly without fear. We would do well to learn from his example. The historian tracked down the American unit, 3rd Company, 106th Infantry Division, and he tracked down the commander, Staff Sergeant Emil Kowalski. He tried to contact surviving members of the company, but most were gone. The few who remained all said the same thing. Sergeant Kowalski had saved their lives. Not through heroics, not through brilliance, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. One of them, Private Jensen, now in his 80s, summed it up best. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like someone's grandfather. But when everything went to hell, he was the only one who didn't panic. He just stood there, calm as could be, and told us what to do. And we listened, because we all knew, that if anyone could get us out alive, it was him. The historian published his findings in a book about forgotten heroes of World War II. It sold moderately well, was reviewed positively, and then disappeared into the vast archive of military history. But for the men who'd been there, who'd walked through that frozen forest in December 1944, the story needed no book. They already knew.